record. Okay, so yeah, I'm pleased to have Caleb present a lot of our results today. He's put a lot of work into the reporting and the analysis, and we're going to go over some key findings here. So I'll pass it over to Caleb, and I might need to let you share your screen here.
Okay, you can hear me okay, Brad?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. And you can see my screen okay?
Yep, that looks like the right one.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's get started. As Brad said, we're going to be going over some key findings from the LakeWatch 2021 season. I won't be covering everything from every lake. If I did, I think we'd be here all day, but we only have a half an hour over lunch. So I'm going to try to distill some of the most interesting things that we're seeing from the lakes last year and how we're developing some of our reporting and analysis to support understanding what's going on in these lakes through our work with the LakeWatch program. So thanks for joining today. Quick refresher, I think most folks who are joining the call know who we are. We're the Alberta Lake Management Society. We're a nonprofit. We've been in operation since '91. Our objective is to improve the understanding and awareness of lakes, reservoirs, and their watersheds, and we have various programs to support that objective. The LakeWatch program is our most well-known and longest running, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today. But we have other programs as well, such as Lake Keepers, that supports monitoring at more isolated lakes or lakes that don't have a lot of historical data. We also do scholarships, support beach monitoring, invasive plant monitoring, support research, and then do education and outreach meetings and conferences such as this. So just as a quick review about how we sample lakes through our LakeWatch program, this lake is Jackfish Lake. It's a satellite image from last summer, and all of the different dots are different sample sites. So the way that we sample a lake is that we start at the profile location, or the location where we take a lot of water chemistry measurements from the top of the lake to the bottom. So we do our profile measurement there. We collect an invertebrate sample from that location as well. And then at that location, and usually 9 others across the lake, we do composite sampling. So we collect water from all these sites, combine it together into one jug, and then that jug gets poured off into a lot of different bottles, which is sent off to different labs for analysis of various water chemistry parameters, biological parameters such as phytoplankton analysis, and also some cyanobacterial toxins as well comes from that composite sampling. And then we also do invasive species sampling through LakeWatch as well. So in July and August, we do additional sampling at certain sites to collect samples that will be analyzed for aquatic invasive mussels, as well as spiny water flea. So as a quick recap about what we did last summer, we sampled 26 lake basins, and that was 105 sampling trips. So that was 4 sampling trips for every lake, except for one lake had an additional sampling trip, had 5. And that means that we did what we set out to do, which was to sample every lake 4 times through the season, once a month from June to September. And it's always amazing to be able to get to every lake every month, considering the weather that we have in Alberta, and also just lining up schedules with volunteers who are also very busy. So kudos to our techs last year, and also to our volunteers for their work last year to make sure we got all the sampling trips completed. We worked with 41 volunteers last year, and they volunteered for about 400 volunteer hours. So a lot of effort went into sampling these lakes from volunteers. And we couldn't have done it without the financial support from Alberta Environment and Parks, LICA, the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association, Wainwright County, Bonnyville County, the town of Hardisty, as well as Alberta Eco Trust. So thank you to our financial sponsors for allowing us to do the sampling through the LakeWatch program last summer. And just quickly, just wanted to recognize Darren as our Darren Lorenz, who was our Alms Volunteer of the year last year. He's our long-term volunteer at Pigeon Lake, and he's very committed, again, sampling this summer. So thanks to Darren for all of his hard work at Pigeon Lake. And we'll be honoring another volunteer in the upcoming LakeWatch season as well for their dedication to the program. Last year, we had 2 field technicians. We had Brittany, who was on the left of your screen with the umbrella, and Carrie. And they worked very hard to get to all the lakes across the province. So thanks to them for their hard work as well. They were really great to work with. Now getting into some of the geography of the lakes that we sampled last year. So we were able to sample lakes within 5 major watersheds across the province. So we were able to sample a few lakes in the Athabasca watershed, lots of lakes in the Beaver River watershed, a lot of lakes in the North Saskatchewan watershed, as well as the Battle, and then a good number of lakes in the Red Deer as well. So we were able to cover watersheds within the central region of the province and got to quite a few of them. And then I also just wanted to show what lakes we sampled through our Alberta Parks rotation. So every year we sample 5 different lakes that are within provincial parks. And this in 2021, it was the Central Lakes, which is a rotation where we sample lakes within a large range of the province that isn't up in Grand Prairie, isn't southeast, or isn't in the foothills. So it's a pretty wide range of lakes going all the way from Crimson Lake, kind of in the southwest there, all the way up to Gregoire Lake, which is near Fort McMurray. As far as the reporting that we did for lakes that were sampled last year, we published 19 LakeWatch reports. So those reports are for individual lakes that were sampled, all of them except for the parks lakes. We don't usually make reports for parks lakes unless they're specifically requested by volunteers. 9 of those reports, we were able to do trend analysis on those lakes. And 2 of those lakes, Gull Lake and Isle Lake, are 2 lakes that this was the first year that we were able to do trend analysis. We published a summary report, and we were able to include lake monitoring data from Lac La Biche County. The county samples 5 lakes every year, and a method that's very similar to LakeWatch. So they've requested that we are able to summarize their results as well to kind of contextualize their lakes from the greater provincial scale. And then we also included the data from both basins of Lesser Slave Lake from last year as well that were sampled by Alberta Environment and Parks. And again, the WPAC for the Lesser Slave region asked if we could summarize the data as well to kind of contextualize the Lesser Slave water quality data for their stakeholders as well. We updated our trend summary report, which is our crack at trying to summarize what trends we're seeing at our lakes across the province to see if how they compare between lakes. And this year was the first year that we published a specific or a separate report for our LakeWatch methods, just to sort of cut down on bloating the reports too much. We took out the methods from each individual report and then referenced this methods report so that people can review that if they're interested in some of our analysis and sampling methods. And you can find all of the ALMS LakeWatch reports on our website from this link. If you just go to our home screen, you have to kind of navigate through a couple of menus. But if you want to go directly to the page that has the reports, this is the link that you can follow. All right, now getting into some of the key findings, observations, and some of the developments that we've been doing to improve how we're reporting and analyzing lake data from the LakeWatch program. So to start things off, we're happy to say that we didn't detect any invasive mussels of any of the LakeWatch lakes in 2021. And also there were no detections of spiny water flea. So that's great to see. Similarly, the LakeWatch technicians were able to support monitoring for Eurasian water milfoil. So a lot of the LakeWatch lakes that were sampled, there were specimens collected, water milfoil specimens collected, as well as lakes that were nearby. So there were 40 specimens collected from 38 lakes, and send those specimens off to the Alberta Plant Health Lab, where they use molecular technique to differentiate whether the specimen is the native northern milfoil or other species of native milfoils, or if it's the invasive Eurasian water milfoil that we're trying to detect. And none of the specimens were Eurasian water milfoil this year, so that's good as well. All right, now getting into actual lake data from the LakeWatch program. This figure shows the average total phosphorus from all of the sampling events for each of the lakes, and the color is the trophic categories, or the categories that we use to differentiate how productive the lakes are. This split is generally what we see for lakes in Alberta. There is a number of lakes that are kind of in that lower productivity oligotrophic and mesotrophic categories. And then there is a large number that can be more productive when we're evaluating total phosphorus. A few lakes in particular last year, Little Beaver and Miquelon, we're seeing really high levels of total phosphorus. When we do the same figure for nitrogen, we're seeing generally when we're categorizing nitrogen levels with these same productivity categories, a lot more lakes are in the high productivity category for nitrogen, and this is also to be expected for our lakes in Alberta. We know that they're enriched with nitrogen, but that there are still a few lakes that have appreciably lower levels of nitrogen as well. And then when we look at the average levels of chlorophyll A from the lake sampled last year, it's similar to the total phosphorus divide, except for there are a lot more lakes that are categorized in the higher productivity categories, like hypereutrophic and eutrophic. And that's just to say that last year we did see quite a few lakes that were productive or getting into these eutrophic and hypereutrophic categories, while there were still a few lakes that were kind of on the lower end where we didn't see the same level of productivity. When we summarize the lakes in terms of their water clarity, again, there's a really wide divide of lakes that were sampled last year. So what we're looking at is the euphotic depth. So if you're familiar with Secchi depth, our euphotic depth is just double that, and it's used to understand how deep light penetrates. So the idea is that depth is the depth to which photosynthesis is possible, and below that point, there isn't enough light. And then we also have the lake profile depth graphed on this figure as well, so that we can compare what the average euphotic depth was for the lake compared to how deep the lake is. And something that sticks out to us when we look at this figure is that there's an interesting relationship between how clear a lake is versus how deep it is. So as we're getting deeper lakes towards the right, we're seeing generally, clear lakes towards the right, we're seeing that most of those lakes have deeper lake profiles. But that's not always the case. There are a couple of lakes that don't follow along well with this this relationship. Like Skeleton Lake North is a very deep lake, but it has very low water clarity. And that's Lac La Biche. The West Basin Lac La Biche is similar, as well as Mini. Yeah. And then when we look at the microcystin levels, average microcystin levels for our lakes last year, microcystin is a cyanobacterial toxin that we monitor for all of our lakes from every sampling event. And that red dashed line is at 10 micrograms per liter, which is the federally mandated guideline for microcystin. So there's a lot of lakes that are really low in microcystin. Many of them are below detection, but there are a number of lakes that are approaching that 10 microgram per liter guideline, and even one, Little Beaver, which is exceeding that. And for us, when we see that microcystin levels are nearing or exceeding the 10 microgram per liter guideline, we're starting to get concerned about exposure of microcystin. And it also is telling us that certain locations on some of these lakes are probably going to be having higher levels of microcystin, because the way that we sample a lake, these are averages across the lake, but microcystin and cyanobacteria can be really patchy on lakes. So where we see scums accumulating, especially near shorelines, we're going to expect to see really high microcystin levels at lakes that are exceeding 10 when it's across the whole lake. All right, getting into some of our interesting observations from last year. If you'll remember, last year we had some periods of smoke in the province. There was fires kind of from all directions last year, especially Saskatchewan and Manitoba, if I remember correctly. And when we were kind of first talking about some of these observations in our webinar series in the fall, one of our questions was, is it possible to see any impact of smoke on things that we're measuring in these lakes? And when I was doing the data analysis, I saw a couple of interesting cases where there were some lakes that were sampled in July where we're seeing that smoke, where there was levels of dissolved oxygen near the surface that were lower than I would anticipate for July. July is when productivity is starting to ramp up, algae and cyanobacteria are starting to grow really well, and we see usually higher levels of dissolved oxygen because of that growth. But for these two lakes, Calling Lake and Lacombe Lake, when they were sampled in July, and for both of the lakes, the July sampling event is that yellow line, and the dissolved oxygen figure is the one on the right. We can see that the surface levels are quite a bit lower compared to the other sampling events. And when I look back at the field sheets for those July sampling events, the technicians had noted smoky conditions. And it kind of makes sense to us when we know that smoke will reduce the light transmittance and to the water surface. And when there's less light, cyanobacteria and other algae as well won't be able to photosynthesize, and dissolved oxygen levels won't be as high because that photosynthesis isn't happening. So I think that's an interesting observation that we're seeing on these smoky days or smoky periods of time, that dissolved oxygen levels are quite a bit lower than what you'd expect, or compared to later in the season when the lakes were sampled and it wasn't smoky. We had an interesting phenomenon at Gull Lake last year. We had a whiting event, and when you're on the water, what a whiting event looks like is what you'd expect a mountain lake like Lake Louise would look like. It's really bright blue, it's turquoise. You're not seeing like scum or anything. It's just the color of the water is that bright blue. And it happens at a couple of our lakes in the province. Crane Lake is another one where this occurs when you're looking at the lake from a satellite image. Like on the right, this is a satellite image from the end of August last year. We have Gull Lake on the top right and Sylvan Lake on the bottom left, and you can see that there's a really striking difference in water clarity or water color when this whiting event is occurring. And what a whiting event is a precipitation of calcium carbonate. So it's this calcium carbonate that's becoming a solid and is attaching to particles in the water. In some cases, this could be algae that are growing in the water. And we're still learning more about what causes whiting events, but generally you can see these whiting events occur at certain lakes with the proper water chemistry conditions. When you have hot spells, which we saw last summer, and where there's increasing levels of productivity. These whiting events aren't toxic or otherwise harmful, but they're interesting phenomena that you can see in lakes every so often. Can't talk about last summer without talking about the heat dome that occurred. So in the top figure, this is just weather station data from 3 stations that are close to Pigeon Lake, Wobbleman Lake, and Lac St. Anne, 3 of lakes that we sampled. And these are 3 lakes that we are also getting reports of whitefish kills last year occurring near that heat dome event. And these whitefish kills often occur during these heat domes because the fish get trapped between the warm water, the surface, and the low oxygen levels near the bottom when the lakes become more stratified in these periods of hot weather. And it's usually the older whitefish that will succumb to these sort of conditions, but it's something that we saw at these 3 lakes last year. And yeah, we'll continue to sort of look out for these events in the future and see if how they're related to heat dome or other heat wave events. And that kind of leads me into a new figure that we have in our reports this year, where it's kind of our first crack at trying to relate our measurements of water temperature with the weather that happened near the lake within the season. So this is the weather lake temperature profile figure for Pine Lake. So in the top 4 panels, it's weather station data that's downloaded from ACIS, Alberta, which is publicly available, really great source for getting and visualizing climate data. The top panel, the black line is the average daily temperature, and the gray line, which is filled in on the bottom, is the normal temperature. So when we compare the normal with what was observed last year, we can kind of evaluate how if the year was really warm and if there were these heat dome events or cold periods. And then we have the same for precipitation, represented as accumulated precipitation, solar radiation, and then the bottom, we have the wind speed. So we use this data and these figures to understand what sort of conditions that we're seeing in the lake. And for Pine Lake, I just pointed out that during the July profile, we had surface temperatures of 26.5 degrees, which is really warm for a lake. It's just about bath water, and that occurred during a period of time where there was a bit of a heat wave after that late June heat dome, but that these heat waves can translate into some really high surface temperatures on the lakes. And then when we evaluate the profiles, say later in the season, we can see the relationship between average air temperature and wind in terms of how the lake is mixing. So it's an interesting figure that we have in our reports now to sort of contextualize sort of the profile data that we're seeing from water temperature measurements and how local weather is impacting the lake. Another interesting observation, one situation that we're keeping kind of a close eye on is Skeleton Lake. And at Skeleton Lake, we sampled the North Basin and the South Basin separately and have been doing that fairly consistently since 2005. And in recent years, kind of since 2019, we've started to observe some interesting changes between the South Basin and the North Basin. The North Basin started becoming a lot more turbid, the water clarity was decreasing. And on the south side, we started seeing some clear water conditions. And so this is a situation that we're kind of keeping an eye on when we're looking at the water chemistry data from last year. When we look at the chlorophyll line, the chlorophyll for the North Basin is quite a bit higher than the South Basin. And the main reason why we're the most concerned about these changes has to do with the marker system levels that we're seeing in the North Basin. They're approaching that 10 microgram per liter guideline, and we're not seeing the same changes in the South Basin. So it's kind of like an interesting question for us to understand what may have led to this recent change in water quality conditions in the North Basin, and why the South Basin is also changing, but kind of in the opposite direction. And one of the main things that we can use to sort of evaluate what else is changing along with the water clarity and the microsystem is to do the trend analysis of historical data. So these two figures show the total phosphorus and chlorophyll levels for each of the lakes going back to 2005. The top panel is the North Basin. And when we do our trend analysis since 2005, we don't see a significant change in total phosphorus, but a significant increase in chlorophyll. But despite that, in recent years, we see that phosphorus levels have kind of increased. But on the South Basin, when we do our trend analysis, there's been a significant decrease in total phosphorus, but no change in chlorophyll. And then when we look at the Secchi depth, or our metric for water clarity, kind of since 2019, possibly a little bit before, at the North Basin, we've been seeing a visual decrease in Secchi depth, and that's a significant decrease when we do our trend analysis. And then on the other end, in the South Basin, we're not seeing a significant change in Secchi depth going back to 2005. But then when we look at that more recent period of data, kind of 2019, we're seeing that there is kind of a response of the South Basin to become more clear. And yeah, it's interesting for us to see how our trend analysis can help us to know what might be happening in these two basins, but there's a lot of other data that we can kind of pull into help us know what's going on in the lake. And one thing that we're really kind of thinking about is how recent water level changes might be impacting where these lakes are going with their water quality. So this is the water level data from Skeleton Lake going back to the mid 60s. And kind of in that period of time when the water levels are really low, the basins were separated. You couldn't boat through the narrows. But 2019, which is the year where we start to see water levels returning again, was the first year that the basins became a bit more connected. So one of the things that we're thinking about is the impact of increasing water levels, possibly increased groundwater as well, and driving some of the changes that we're seeing in Skeleton Lake. Okay, I'm gonna move over to our trend analysis a little bit and present how we're developing, how we're doing trend analysis. But just as a bit of a reminder about how we do trend analysis, the lakes that are selected for trend analysis need at least 10 or more years of data, and they have to be sampled fairly consistently. And our guideline for that is that there must not be a data gap greater than 1/3 of the total range of years. So when we do our reporting every year for LakeWatch, we're looking at lakes that have 10 or more years of data and they can't have this data gap. And when they fulfill that requirement, then we do our additional trend analysis of these lakes to see for specific parameters how they might be changing. We remove May and October data because the way that we sample lakes now, we only sample them in between June and September. But for lakes that have a lot of historical data that includes May and October data, like Wabamun, we will include that because that's what was most consistently used. And then we only select one sample per month closest to the 15th day each month. And then we do the trend analysis following the method of the seasonal Kendall or man Kendall, depending on if we detect seasonality or not in the data. And then the results from the trend analysis indicate whether there's a significant monotonic or unidirectional trend for total phosphorus, chlorophyll A, total dissolved solids or TDS, and Secchi depth. And then we can also look at the rate of change as well, or the slope to evaluate, even if the trend is significant, the slope can kind of tell us to what extent the trend is changing things in the lake, whether it's an appreciable change or not, even if it's significant. And then we produce box plot and line figures to visually communicate some of these these historical trends. And as of 2021, we have trend analysis for 18 LakeWatch lakes. And this is also the first year that we kind of built out the trend analysis to explore more of the ions that make up the total dissolved solid fraction, to understand what ions might be driving total dissolved solid increases or decreases in our lakes. So this is an example of the figures that we produce for lakes that have trend analysis. This is Wabamun Lake. It's our lake that has the most historical data. And this is an example of the box plot figures. So for total phosphorus, it's the orange figure. And for Wabamun, we would report that it has a significantly decreasing trend in total phosphorus. For total dissolved solids, it's our purple figure. We reported a significant increase. For chlorophyll, we reported a significant decrease, but we can use these figures to sort of evaluate, okay, there's a significant decrease based off of the statistics, but when you look at the actual box plot and apply the slope, we can see that even if there is a significant decrease, it's not really an appreciable decrease based off of the box plots, and that there's still a lot of variability each year. And then lastly, we do Secchi depth, like I mentioned, and for Wabamun Lake, there was no significant change. So we have these figures and we have these results from the statistics to say whether we're detecting significant increases or decreases or no change at all for these 4 parameters. And then, as I said, we sort of developed our trend analysis to include specific ions that make up that total dissolved solid fraction. So total dissolved solids is kind of a calculated parameter, which is defined by different ions, different major ions that make up the ion abundance of the lake. So the major ions that make up that total dissolved solid fraction include sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, chloride, sulfate, and then bicarbonates, which can be, or carbonates and bicarbonates, which we summarize as alkalinity, because it's usually the alkalinity parameter that's used to calculate total dissolved solids. And this is what we would produce for all of the lakes. So on the top left, we have total dissolved solids as a purple line with the grayed out background. And then we can look at the trends for each of the sub ions to help us know, for a lake like Wildman Lake, what is the major ions that are driving the change. And when we look at which ions might be driving the change, we could start to understand maybe what is the cause, whether it's changes in water level and evaporation or specific watershed events. And when we look at Wildman Lake, the way that we evaluated it is that we saw that sulfates and alkalinity and sodium were the major ions that were contributing to the change in total dissolved solids by looking visually at their trend, by seeing that they had a significant increasing trend, and then also the magnitude of their slope. And yeah, when we have this information, we can also, like I said, draw in specific events within the watershed that might have led to some of these changes. And for Wildman Lake, it's going to be interesting for us to look at maybe how addition of treated water has changed the levels of these specific ions over time and total dissolved solids as a whole. All right, now getting to more of how we summarize our trend data. So the top figure sort of communicates the spread of time that we use for each of the lakes that have trend analysis. So about half the lakes we have data that is about spans about 35 or 40 years, and the other half spans just about 15 or 20 years. And we also have this figure on the bottom, which we use to evaluate the number of lakes that have increasing, decreasing, or no trends for each of these parameters. So for chlorophyll, for instance, we see about half the lakes have increasing levels of chlorophyll. And then for the other half of lakes, there's either a decreasing trend or no trend detected. It's a similar case for Secchi depth, except opposite. For total dissolved solids, for all 18 of our lakes, we have significant trends detected, majority which have significant increasing trends. And then for total phosphorus, about half of the lakes have significant decreasing trends in total phosphorus, and then the other half either have increasing levels of total phosphorus or no trend detected. And then another way that we can summarize some of our trend data is to evaluate how the lakes compare in the magnitude of their trends. So these figures show the slopes, which gives us an idea of the magnitude of change. And these figures only include lakes where we have significant trends detected. So if the trends were decreasing, they are red and they're going to have negative slopes. And if they have significant increasing trends, they're going to be those green boxes and have positive slopes. And one thing that we kind of take away from this figure is that chlorophyll and Secchi depth have a relationship that we would expect. About the same number of lakes that have increasing trends in chlorophyll have decreasing Secchi depth. So these lakes are getting greener and less clear, and that we see that the slopes for these lakes are pretty variable. But for lakes that have decreasing chlorophyll or increasing Secchi, so clearer conditions, the slopes are really close to zero. So even though they have these lakes are getting less green and are a bit more clear, the changes aren't evaluating the slopes, the changes aren't really appreciable. Another thing that we see as well when we look at the total phosphorus, for example, is that it's kind of counterintuitive for us to see that total phosphorus doesn't follow what we're seeing with chlorophyll and Secchi depth, and that the majority of lakes with significant trends for total phosphorus actually have decreasing trends, but that for lakes that have increasing, there is a pretty wide range of slopes or magnitudes of change, and that only 2 lakes actually have both increasing levels of total phosphorus and chlorophyll A, and those lakes are Moose Lake and Laurier Lake. And what may explain sort of the disconnect with how the trends are playing out for chlorophyll and total phosphorus could be a couple of things. I think the lake identity is really important. There could be a impact of climate that we're seeing that's resulting in lakes becoming a bit greener or water clarity reducing. And also we have to consider the time span of the trend analysis. So it's likely that a lot of these lakes had historical increases in total phosphorus that could be leading to higher levels of chlorophyll, but that we don't have data that goes that far back to detect that trend. All right, this is the last trend figure that I'm going to show. This is the one that I think we're pretty excited to report on. So just to kind of orient what we're looking at, it's kind of split up the same way is that ion figure for individual lakes, but this is our way of trying to summarize the trends of all the ions together to see when we put all the lakes together, are we seeing similarities in how the ion levels are changing over time? Or are we seeing certain ions kind of sticking out as being important or behaving similarly across lakes. So what we're looking at is the standard concentration of the ions from each of the lakes. So we standardize the data by scaling the concentration data to a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 so that we can compare all the lakes on the same y-axis. And then on the x, we have the normal trend analysis figure, which is just to see the years, and that if the lakes are, or the lines are green, those are each individual lakes. If the lines are green, those are significant increases. If they're red, they're significantly decreasing. If they're blue, no significant trend is detected. And then for some of the ions, we didn't have enough data to do the trend analysis. So that's why we have the bar graph on the right, which shows the count of how many lakes, and if there's a certain number of lakes that have insufficient data for this trend analysis. And that's the case for magnesium and calcium, because there was a certain period of time where the lab that we were working with was reporting, not reporting calcium and magnesium data. So for those two parameters, we don't have all 18 of the lakes represented. And then the lines represent the lowest trends of the data. So when I look at this, I see a lot of lines that are green. So across all of the ions. So a lot of the lakes have have increasing levels of total dissolved solids, also have increasing levels in a lot of the other ions as well. And that there's a lot of variability across the ions as well. And that with all the ions kind of increasing in many of the lakes, it could be due to changes in water levels over time, impacts of precipitation, evaporation, as well as groundwater. But one thing that really sticks out to me with this figure is when we look at the chloride panel, which is on the right side, second from the bottom, it has the most lakes with increasing levels of chloride, 16 lakes in total, and that the lines have less variability and that they have a pretty stable increasing trajectory over time. So I think that that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on with our lakes moving forward, is how chloride is changing and how that could be related to activities within the watersheds of these lakes. Just to wrap up where some of our some of our work is going to go for trend analysis with our LakeWatch data, we want to eventually start to do trend analysis on water temperature and dissolved oxygen. We have a lot of data from these lakes that span back pretty far, but we haven't yet tackled how to do trend analysis on profile data, but I think would be really interesting to look at. We want to try to start to tie the changes in water quantity or water level with water quality data as well, to see how much changes in water quality are related to water levels. And that'll be interesting to look at for total dissolved solids or salinity in particular. We want to start to integrate watershed events into our water quality timelines to see how specific events within the watershed, such as water diversions, treated water additions, or changes in basin connectivity relate to the trends of water quality that we're seeing. And then we want to try to relate climate factors and weather with water quality a bit more to see what the influence of wet years, warm years, or heat waves kind of have on how the lakes are changing over time. And now to wrap up the presentation, I just am going to talk real quickly about what the next summer looks like. So we have 26 lake basins that we're sampling through LakeWatch this year. We have 2 techs again this year. They're already sampling. They sampled 8 lakes last week, and this week Kirsten is up in Grand Prairie sampling, and Dominic is sampling lakes in the Beaver River watershed. So they're already out sampling, getting a lot of data. And we're going to continue to do invasive species monitoring for Eurasian water milfoil and dry sanded mussels. Our LakeWatch techs are going to be supporting beach sampling for Enterococcus and cyanobacteria as part of the Alberta Health Rec Water monitoring program. And we are going to be supporting the validation of the Pigeon Lake monitoring buoy again this summer. And just to wrap up really quick, I want to say thanks again to all of our supporters and financial support in particular from last year. Also Alberta Environment and Parks for their logistical support, and in the office helping us with our equipment as well. We couldn't do the LakeWatch program without the support of environment staff. And if you want to learn more about your lake in particular, because I wasn't able to talk about any specific lakes today in depth, but you can find out more about your lake if you go onto our website and find the LakeWatch report for your lake. If you have any questions about your lake in particular, or how we analyze data, or if you have any concerns, you can always feel free to reach out to us either by phone, or you can email me. My email is on the bottom there, programs@alms.ca. And with that, I think we have some time for questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Caleb. So there are a number of questions in the chat. The first one maybe I can address is about how could additional funding impact the LakeWatch program? And yeah, there's a question about would that allow us to expand to more lakes? And in many ways, it could. And in other scenarios, we might use additional funding to purchase equipment that we need for some of our other programs, like our Lake Keepers program. So, we tend to run a pretty tight budget here. And so any additional funding is, of course, always welcome, and we make good use of it. And the second part to this question is there a good provincial watershed map online? And yeah, I can throw one in the chat box here. I'll throw a link to it in the chat box here. I know there's a good map of all the provincial watershed planning advisory councils. So,
yeah, I found that one, Brad, thanks. And I was more interested to see if there was one that gets right down to the actual lakes themselves. So that shows the relationship between Jackfish Lake, for example, versus Mink Lake just north of it, and maybe getting a little bit more granular within the individual watersheds.
Okay, so also on our website, we do have individual lake watershed maps. I could point you to that.
I can take a look for them.
Sure, and a lot of the watershed planning advisory councils, a lot of those partners have nice state of the watershed reports that have really great maps in those as well. So we'll see if we can find you what you're looking for there.
I think I found them. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's cool. We talk a lot about at Jackfish about what the watershed is, and people have a hard time understanding specifically what we're talking about at Jackfish, that the watershed is quite small with respect to the actual lake area itself. We're kind of a little cylinder, so to speak. So this is interesting to try and help educate people from that perspective.
Yeah, there's a few good resources, and I think Jackfish Lake has a state of the watershed report, which should have some good figures as well. That was produced by the NSWA.
Not as good as this one that's on your site. This is great.
Okay, perfect.
Cool, thanks, Brad.
There's also a question here about the relationship between phosphorus and chlorophyll A. And maybe Caleb, I'll let you tackle that one, and I'll put a handy link in the chat for everyone about this question too.
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe I kind of blew over it a little bit because I don't know, I get caught in just talking about the data and don't understand or don't explain specifically why we're looking at those parameters. But phosphorus is generally the most limiting nutrient that limits the growth of algae and cyanobacteria in our lakes in Alberta. There are other nutrients that are important as well, but generally the science and the research out there shows that phosphorus is the most limiting nutrient to the growth of these algae and cyanobacteria, that we assess their growth, their level of growth, their abundance by using chlorophyll A, because chlorophyll A is a pigment that's conservative across algae, different types of algae, as well as cyanobacteria. So they are definitely going to be linked, but the way that they're linked isn't always clear or isn't always linear. A lot of other factors come into play when we evaluate the relationship. So within the specific LakeWatch reports, we do talk about the relationship between phosphorus that year and chlorophyll that year, and we evaluate their correlation. And for certain lakes, there is a clear correlation between phosphorus and chlorophyll within seasons. And then for trend analysis as well, we evaluate their correlation over time. And yeah, just to say to the last part of that question, the source of chlorophyll, it's used as a proxy to understand the abundance of algae and cyanobacteria. And I think Brad may have posted a link. There's a lot of really great information about phosphorus chlorophyll relationships out there. Hope that answers your question, Gavin.
Sure does. Thank you, Caleb.
So there's another question here that maybe I can try to tackle, which says, have there been any restoration projects at Skeleton Lake to help reduce phosphorus, or is this happening without manipulation? And it's a great question. Skeleton Lake has an interesting history where the local municipality was approved to withdraw water from Skeleton Lake. And it was discovered many years into that approval that the municipality was actually drawing too much water over their allowed amount. And so there's some thinking that that has really impacted the lake levels. And there's also been work done to determine if roads in the watershed were actually kind of cutting the watershed short and not allowing water to drain from one creek into the lake area. So there's been some efforts to improve drainage within the watershed. In terms of phosphorus management, I'm not aware of really specific activities happening at Skeleton Lake. So I think the main point of interest for us right now is those really strongly increasing water levels and the reconnection of the North Basin with the South Basin through the Narrows. So an interesting history of water withdrawals and development within the watershed. Okay.
Maybe just to kind of add on to Skeleton Lake, I didn't say in the presentation, but that another interesting thing that we're observing in the lake is that these levels of microcystin and cyanobacteria are persistent in the North Basin through the winter, which is not characteristic usually of other cyanobacteria blooms that we see in other lakes in the province. So it's another part of what makes the lake interesting as well, is that we see sort of a prevalence of cyanobacteria and high levels of this microcystin year round.
Great. And there's a question from Tina wondering about, in your TD trend analysis slide, if you want to go back to that one, she's wondering about the black line.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. So you're looking at the bar graph on the right of each of the line figures. So when the ID means insufficient data, so for some of the lakes, we don't actually have enough data for some of the ions to actually do trend analysis. So even though these lakes were sampled in those years, the way that the samples were analyzed in the labs, we didn't actually get data for mainly calcium and magnesium for certain lakes over that period of time. So I just put ID and show the number of lakes that have insufficient data so that we know why there's so many less lines in the line figure when we're evaluating how calcium and magnesium might be changing in these lakes over time, because we don't actually have enough data to do the trend analysis on those lakes for those ions.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caleb. There's a question just asking if the recording will be posted, and yes, we'll definitely post this following the presentation. Thanks for that question, Dawn. We also have a question from Wendell wondering about no sampling in the South Saskatchewan Basin and any plans to sample lakes or reservoirs in the Milk Basin.
No sampling at all in the South Sask. Yeah, we, with the program, we get to a lot of lakes in the Beaver because of funding, and we get to different lakes across the province through the provincial park rotation. But the rest of the lakes, we sample based off of volunteers reaching out to us as well. So yeah, we don't have any other lakes within the Bow. Oh, we're getting back to Chestermere actually this summer, which is within the Bow. But yeah, it's interesting to talk about the lakes in the Milk or even in the Old Man. They're definitely undersampled. There's a lot less of them, but it's definitely an area that we also want to try to get water quality data from, but that it's based off of volunteers reaching out to us who are interested in sampling. And also we're trying to develop a relationship with folks down in the South to possibly sample through our Lake Keepers program, so that they can sample these lakes on their own, because it's otherwise it's sometimes challenging for our techs to get down there because they're based in Edmonton. But we're always looking to get to new lakes and to support sampling at lakes where volunteers are interested in sampling. So it's definitely on our mind to make sure that we're getting across the province, but just the way that works out, we're not able to get to as many lakes in the South Saskatchewan or even in the Milk, as many as we would like to.
Great, and there's a question here from T. Maybe I can take a stab at this one. What solutions do you have for harmful algae blooms, cyanobacteria, and E. coli as well? So the main method for managing lakes currently in Alberta is through watershed management approaches, and we definitely encourage folks to develop lake watershed management plans, and we have resources on our website for undertaking those activities, and we've seen some good efforts within some of our lake watersheds to conduct lake watershed management. We also try to regularly educate our stewards and members on in-lake treatment methods, and we've had many presentations over the years on products like Phoslock and alum, and I know that other products like hydrogen peroxide have been used somewhat successfully. So we recognize that there's a combined approach, but currently the main efforts in Alberta are around lake watershed management. And regarding E. coli, that was part of the question. We're doing a lot of work this summer and last summer on monitoring beaches for Enterococcus, and we're working with the Hannington Lab at the University of Alberta to improve our ability to conduct microbial source tracking on some of these samples and really determine where some of those contaminants might be coming from. So I think determining where the contamination is coming from would open up some management options for us. So hopefully that answers that question. There's also a comment in the chat from Chris Ricard, who's one of the data managers with the province. And she made a great point that the provincial water quality data portal displays lake composite station codes and that some subbasin or watershed layers are available. So if you bear with me, or maybe, yeah, if you bear with me, I will see if I can throw that into the chat for everyone. And Caleb, if you just want to take a check in the chat for any further questions while I bring this up here.
I don't see anything right now, but happy to take more questions if anybody has any more.
Okay, that link is in the chat there. I don't see any more questions or any hands up, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up the session. It's 12:59, perfect timing. So thanks everyone for your thoughtful questions, and thanks to Caleb for putting this presentation together for us. We'll make sure we get the presentation posted, as I know some people had to join late today. So we'll make sure we post that and notify everyone who is here today. And we're looking forward to another summer of LakeWatch. So keep an eye out for us on the lakes this summer, and definitely let Caleb know if you have a lake of interest that you'd like to get monitored through the LakeWatch program. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and end the session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thank you both.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Michelle.
Thank you, Caleb.
Thanks,
You're welcome.
Wendell.
Thank you, Bradley.
Thanks for sending us that Lake Louise info.
Yep.
I haven't dived into it yet, but it's exciting.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. You
Yeah.
can't get more iconic than Lake Louise. So